Everyone has the ability to become more creative, and I believe everyone should make at least some effort to do so. Just increasing your creative output a tiny amount can make a huge difference in your day to day life. In this course, I'll share with you a set of techniques and behaviors to make you more creative. I'll focus on what you individually need to do to be more creative, and I'll show you how to lead effective group sessions for a better creative output. I'm Drew Boyd, and I've been in the industry for over 30 years. I teach creativity to graduate students, and I help companies improve their innovation effectiveness. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Think about how your brain spends its typical day. The truth is, your brain is generating ideas constantly. It might be thinking about the best route to drive home, or it may be thinking about the best route for your career. Big or small, the ideas you generate shape every aspect of your life. Making your daily ideas better, meaning more creative, makes your everyday life better. It's that simple. Being creative helps you live longer and can improve your quality of health in life. Researchers found that only creativity, not intelligence or overall openness, decreased mortality risk. For example, creating artwork decreases negative emotions. It reduces stress and anxiety and improves medical outcomes. Being creative helps you become a better problem solver in all areas of your life and work. Instead of coming from a linear, logical approach, your creative side can approach a situation from all angles. Creativity helps you see things differently and better deal with uncertainty. That makes you a more valuable employee no matter what job you're in. Being creative comes with many ups and downs and a high risk of failure. So you have to be vulnerable to share your ideas and willing to take the risk that what you create may never see the light of day. Engaging in the creative process is a great confidence builder because you discover that failure is part of the process. Once we see failure as something that is survivable and something that helps us grow and that it makes our work better, we can release the fear and try new things, even at the risk of failing. Let's face it, life can be difficult at times, so I want you to see creativity as a buffer and as a tool to work through the tough times. Taking the time to learn creativity is worth it. Let's start with some definitions. First, what exactly is creativity? Think of creativity as a process that happens up here inside your head. Your body functions with lots of processes, like digestive processes, breathing, and so on. Creative thinking is just one more of them. But your brain produces lots of thoughts that aren't creative. So, what's the difference? A creative thought is something that meets three criteria: it's new, it's useful, and it's surprising. Let me explain these criteria. An idea is new if you've never had it before. Now, it may be new to you, but not necessarily new to the world. Others may have had the idea before you. Well, that's okay because it's still new from your perspective. Useful means the idea can be put into practice for somebody's benefit. I call that process innovation. Now, surprising is the tricky one. To be honest, I'm not sure how best to explain what surprising means. Maybe the best way is this. You know how certain ideas just strike you in a way that makes you slap your forehead and say, gee, why didn't I think of that? The idea is so cool, simple, and obvious that you immediately see the cleverness and usefulness. You're both delighted and surprised by the idea because it makes you smile or even chuckle. For me, those types of ideas get high grades. But how does the brain produce these ideas? What research shows, as well as my own experience, the brain does two things. First, it generates a concept and then explores the value of that concept. It's something called geneplore, generation, and exploration. The creative concept gets in your head when you force two previously unrelated themes to suddenly collide or come together. This collision might happen accidentally, or as you'll see in this course, you can force these collisions to happen anytime you want. Think of this concept as a pre inventive form. You're not sure what it is or what it does at this step, and it may seem ridiculous or absurd. But then something amazing happens. Your brain takes that form and connects it with some benefit or solves some problem. The brain starts with an undeveloped form created by this collision, then searches your memory for some reason why that form would be useful. Hey, the good news is that your brain likes doing this, and it's pretty good at it. All you have to do is get those concepts into your brain so it can do its job. What holds people back from being creative? Is it a lack of time? Do you not have a budget for doing creative work? Or perhaps you work in an industry where there are lots of regulatory or legal barriers that seem to make it hard to generate novel ideas. For many people, these types of constraints seem frustrating and overwhelming. They appear to be strict boundaries that seem to limit your ability to be creative. But guess what? Surprisingly, constraints are not a barrier to creativity. In fact, constraints are a necessary condition for creativity to occur. Your brain works harder and smarter when given tight boundaries. The more constrained you are, the more creative you'll be. So, what is it that seems to limit our creativity? Well, the answer is a condition known as fixedness. Fixedness is a cognitive bias that limits our ability to see the world around us differently than what we're used to. There are at least three types. First is functional fixedness. Functional fixedness makes it hard for you to consider an object doing a job other than what you know it to do. When you see a dry erase marker, for example, you instantly relegate it to the job of, well, marking. If you could force it in your mind to be available to do another job, you end up with a creative idea. Now, one of my pet peeves is when someone takes a permanent marker and writes on a whiteboard. Okay, maybe I've done it once or twice. Now, when that happens, take a regular dry erase marker and write over it. Voila! The permanent marks are gone. Now that's creative. The second type is structural fixedness. This type makes it really hard to imagine objects having a different structure than what we're used to. Let's go back to our dry erase marker. Why are these markers always straight? Well, that's fixedness. What if you could imagine a curved marker, or perhaps one with a grip? Instead of holding it like a pencil, we can bend it so it fits in our hand better. Again, that's creative. And finally is what we call relational fixedness. This type of fixedness makes it very hard to imagine two objects having a relationship that wasn't there before. As one object changes, the other object changes. Our mind doesn't form these connections naturally because of relational fixedness. Let's go back to our marker example. What if it could change colors automatically when writing on different areas of the whiteboard? Are there certain applications where that would be more convenient? When we find that application, we've generated a creative idea. We've broken through our fixedness to create new value. Now, we have all three types of fixedness, and they hold back our ability to generate new possibilities. But the good news is, you can break all three types. That's what this course is all about. So, where do great ideas come from? The answer might surprise you. Let's look at the most successful rock band in history, the Beatles. In a biography of Paul McCartney, he shared his secret. John often had just the first verse, which was always enough. It was the direction, it was the signpost, and it was the inspiration for the whole song. I hate the word, but it was the template. Many artists, authors, songwriters, and composers also use templates of some form. Innovators, for thousands of years, have used patterns into their inventions, usually without realizing it. Those patterns are now embedded into the products and services you see around you. I want you to think of them almost as the DNA of a product or service. Imagine if there was a way for you to extract that DNA and reapply it to the products and services that are important to you. This is the essence of a method you're going to learn about in this course called systematic inventive thinking. We call it SIT for short. With SIT, innovation follows a set of patterns that can be reapplied to any product, service, or process. What these patterns do is they channel your ideation process. They regulate your thinking so that you can innovate in a systematic way on demand. Surprisingly, the majority of innovative products and services can be explained by just 5 patterns. First is subtraction. Then we have division. Then there's multiplication. Next is task unification. And finally is attribute dependency. These 5 patterns are a crucial foundation to being creative. Most people think the way you create an idea is to start with a well formed problem and then brainstorm a solution to it. Well, what if you turn that around 180 degrees? It sounds counterintuitive, but you really can innovate by starting with the solution and then work backwards to the problem. Imagine I'm holding a baby's milk bottle. The milk bottle changes color when the temperature of the milk changes. Now, quickly, ask yourself, why would that be beneficial? Well, if you're like most people, you would see that this concept would help you prevent the baby from being burned with milk that's too hot. In the systematic inventive thinking method, we call this direction of thinking the function follows form principle. Here's how it works. First, you start with an existing situation. That situation can be a product, it can be a service, or perhaps a process. You take that item and you make a list of its components and its attributes. Then you apply one of the 5 thinking tools. They're called subtraction, division, multiplication, task unification, and attribute dependency. Now, when you apply one of the 5 tools to the existing situation, you artificially change it. It morphs into something that, at first, might seem really weird or even absurd. That's perfectly normal. In fact, as you get more comfortable with this method, you'll come to expect it. Now, we consider this strange thing a virtual product. It doesn't really exist except in one place, right up here in your mind. Now, take your time when applying one of the 5 thinking tools. You have to mentally define and visualize this virtual product. I like to close my eyes at this step and mentally see an image of the item once it's been manipulated. Now, as you practice the method more, this will get a lot easier. At the next stage, you ask yourself 2 questions and you do it in this specific order. The first question is, should we do it? And the second is, can we do it? Now, here's what I mean by that. Does the concept help people in any way? And if so, is it feasible to make? Hey, if it doesn't meet these simple criteria, don't waste any more time on it. If you pass through both questions, you move to the adaptation step, where you allow yourself some degree of freedom to modify the concept to make it even stronger. You may have to iterate through these steps several times before you end up with what I would consider an idea. Take a look at these four items and tell me, what do they have in common? Here you see an exercise bicycle, a package of powdered soup, a contact lens, and a child's high chair, the kind that slips over the edge of the table. Do you see it? Now, most people would answer that they're all consumer goods or that they all provide convenience to the consumer. And while that's true, that's not what I'm looking for. Take a look at how they were constructed. Compare them to an earlier form of the product. Now, do you see it? Each of the items has had something subtracted from an original form of a product. The exercise bike has had the rear wheel removed. The powdered soup has had the water removed. What about the contact lens? Well, it's had the frames removed. And the child's high chair has had the legs removed. All four of these products are examples of what can be created using the subtraction technique. First, we define subtraction as the elimination of an essential component rather than an addition of new systems and functions. To use the technique, follow the steps of the function follows form principle. First, list the internal components. The internal components are those that are directly on or connected to the product. For example, with the bicycle, we would list the seat, the handlebars, the wheels, and so on. Then apply subtraction by removing a component. Now, don't be bashful here. Pick something that you think is essential to the product or service. In our example, let's imagine removing the rear wheel. At first glance, this may seem absurd, and that's perfectly normal. At this next stage, you ask yourself two questions, and you do it in this specific order. First question is, should we do it? And the second question is, can we do it? In the bike example, removing the back wheel creates a stationary bike that is perfect for exercising in your home, and it's feasible to remove the rear wheel to create this configuration. Now, once you complete this first round, the subtraction technique allows you to replace the function of the missing component. We first try to replace it within the immediate vicinity of where the consumer uses the product. If not, we think of how we could import some technology or other component from outside the closed world. Again, in the bike example, maybe you can add a stand to replace the rear wheel or a fan to cool the person who is exercising. Subtraction is a powerful technique because it breaks fixedness and forces you to mentally imagine all the remaining components delivering some new value. Division is a powerful technique because it forces you to break fixedness, especially structural fixedness. Division forces you to create configurations by rearranging components in ways you were not likely to have done on your own. The division technique works by dividing a product or its components functionally or physically and then rearranging them back into the product. To apply the division technique, you start by listing the product's internal components. Next, you divide the product or one of the components. And there are three ways you can do this. First is functionally, where you rearrange along some functional role. For example, a water sport company took the controls of the speedboat and then functionally divided them off and placed them into the handle of the water ski tow rope. Now the water skier controls the movements of the boat without having a separate driver. Next is physically, where you are cutting the product or component along any physical line. Now, physical division is different than functional in that we are actually making a cut along some physical line of the product itself or a component. Take a look at this car radio. In this example, The faceplate has been physically cut away from the main radio. When you leave your car, you grab the faceplate by pulling it away from the main radio and taking it with you. That makes the main radio completely worthless, so thieves won't break into your car to steal it. And the third type is called preserving. That means you divide the product into smaller versions of itself. Each smaller unit preserves the characteristics of the whole. A real simple example of this is what you see here. Cupcakes are essentially smaller versions of a normal sized cake. So once you've rearranged the components, your work is not done. You still need to ask yourself two important questions in the right order. Should we do it? And can we do it? Finally, you modify and adapt the concept to improve it. The division technique cuts your biggest challenges down to size so you can see new, innovative opportunities. A common problem in photography is the occurrence of red eye. Red eye happens when the flash of a camera goes into the eyeball. It hits the back of your eye, which has a lot of tiny blood vessels. The light picks up the red color from the blood in those vessels, and it bounces straight back into your camera lens. Your friends get that eerie red eye look. But today's cameras have a clever and simple way to defeat red eye. They have a dual flash. The first flash causes the person's pupil to constrict enough so that very little light will get in. At that exact moment, the second flash goes off and lights up the subject matter. Voila, no red eye. This innovation is a classic example of the multiplication technique. The multiplication technique is defined as copying an element already existing in the product or service, but changing it in some counterintuitive way. To use the technique, begin by listing the components of the product, process, or service. You pick one of those components and you make a copy of it. You keep the original component as is, but the copied component is changed. Using function follows form, you look at the potential benefits and you modify or adapt the concept to improve it to yield an innovative idea. So how do you change the multiplied component? Let's use a refrigerator to demonstrate this handy tool. First, create a table like the one you see here. You list the components down the left-hand column. Then for each component, you identify its attributes. Attributes are things like its weight, its shape, its height, or its color. You list the attributes for each component. Now here in the far right column, you start to visualize each virtual product for each multiplied component and each of its attributes. A simple table like this can help you keep organized using this very powerful technique. Now here's an example of multiplication. The consumer products company, Procter & Gamble, used the multiplication technique to create the Febreze Noticeable Air Freshener. It's called noticeable because it has a very clever way to keep you smelling the scent. After a period of time, your nose becomes too accustomed to a smell, and the brain shuts it out. But this little product gets around that. It has not one, but two different scents. The first scent pulses out into the room, but then stops right about the time your nose stops recognizing it. Just then, the second scent starts pulsing out into the room. Your nose picks up where the other one left off. Pretty clever. Multiplication accounts for many new products and services, and it's straightforward to use. You want to make this powerful technique part of your innovation arsenal. The famous inventor, Thomas Edison, lived in a beautiful home. But something was unusual about the gate that led into his house. His visitors had to push the gate very hard to open it, and then again, very hard to close it. It seemed odd that such a successful inventor like Thomas Edison wouldn't fix his gate. Well, rumor has it that Thomas had attached a pump to his gate so that every time someone opened or closed it, they were pumping fresh water into the plumbing system of his house. This is a great example of the innovation technique called task unification. Task unification is defined as the assignment of additional tasks to an existing resource. Now, that resource can be a component of a product or service, or it can be something in the immediate vicinity of the product or service. Hey, think back to the story of Thomas's gate. The gate has its primary job of letting visitors through, but it also has the additional job of pumping water. But that's not all of the story. The guests coming to visit Thomas are also a resource. They have their primary job of being friends of Thomas, but now they have the additional job of activating the gate to open and close it. To use task unification, begin by listing the product's internal components as well as the external components, the things right around where the product is being used. You select a component and assign it an additional task. That creates the virtual product. Using function follows form, you look for potential benefits and you modify or adapt the concept to improve it. Now, there are three general ways you can apply task unification. One way is to have an internal component take the job of another internal component. Think of it as that component is stealing the function of the other component. Here's an example. What you see here looks like an ordinary coffee maker. In fact, this product has a clever little innovation inside. The coffee maker's filter has the additional job of measuring just the right amount of coffee to use given how much water was put in. It gives you the perfect brew every time. You could also have an internal component take the job of an external component. Nissan, the Japanese automaker, has a nifty idea to make it easier to fill your tires with air. The car's horn will beep to let you know when you've reached the right tire pressure. It's called the Easy Fill Tire Alert. In this example, the car's horn steals the job of the tire pressure gauge. You could also have an external component steal the job of an internal component. Imagine billboards in a subway station that show grocery products on the shelves just the way you would see it in a store. Commuters use their smartphones to scan the products they need, and that shopping list is sent to the grocery store so the commuter can stop by on the way home to pick up the groceries. In this example, the billboards are assigned the additional task of becoming the point of sale. Very convenient, and it saves time. And that's how task unification can lead you to some pretty clever ideas. What do these items have in common? Here's a traffic stoplight, the kind that changes color as the car pulls up to the light. Next is a crescendo alarm clock. It starts off ringing very softly and then gradually gets louder until you finally wake up. Next are transition sunglasses, the kind that get darker as it gets brighter outside. And finally, happy hour. Do you see the pattern? In each case, one item is changing in response to something else. In the case of the traffic light, it turns green in response to the presence of a car at the intersection. The loudness of the crescendo alarm clock changes in response to time. The darkness of the lens changes in response to the brightness of the external light. And happy hour? Well, the price you pay for drinks at a bar changes in response to the time of day. You should see that as one thing changes, another thing changes, and that is the hallmark of the attribute dependency technique. To use attribute dependency, you make two lists. First is a list of the attributes of the surrounding environment and people related to the topic you're working on. Now, these could be physical attributes like Width or length or height. They might also be characteristics of people like gender, age, and personal preferences. I suggest you always include on your list the attribute of time. That could be time of day, elapsed time, and so on. Whatever best relates to your topic. Now be sure to number these attributes 1, 2, 3, and so on. The second list are the attributes of the product or service you're working on. Attributes are different than components, where a component is usually a physical or tangible thing you can see or touch. An attribute is a characteristic of the product or service. For example, the screen of a TV is a component, while the size of the screen would be an attribute. Now, be sure to list these out with letters A, B, C, and so on. Now you're ready to apply attribute dependency. Randomly select one attribute from each list. For example, attribute 5 and attribute C. Now here's the critical part. Create a simple phrase that sounds like this. As attribute 5 changes, so does attribute C. That becomes your virtual product. Using function follows form, you identify potential benefits and target markets. And finally, you modify and adapt the concept to improve it. Look at the previous examples like the crescendo alarm clock. Our virtual product would have been, as elapsed time increases, the loudness of the alarm increases. These attributes would have come from the two lists we would have created. To demonstrate attribute dependency, I've provided an exercise file. Attribute dependency is powerful, so be sure to use it the right way to create amazing creative concepts. A fast way to boost your creativity is to harness the brainpower of others. Creativity is a team sport, and you'll generate better ideas if you surround yourself with people to help you. When you invite colleagues to be part of a creativity session, be sure to create a diverse team. Diversity helps people see more possibilities. It creates a stronger sense of group accountability. Diverse groups cause people to bring their best thinking, to behave properly, and to maintain their status in the group as a positive contributor. You want diversity in three ways: functional, gender, and cultural. Functional diversity means that team members come from different parts of the company. Now, it depends a lot on the topic you're generating ideas for. Generally speaking, I try to include coworkers from marketing, from my technical team, and from my sales or customer support team. But at times, it makes sense to include colleagues with financial skills or regulatory knowledge. Taken together, you want the right people in the room who can help you not only generate ideas, but also help you decide which ideas are the best and most feasible. That takes a team of people with different skills and knowledge. You also need a team with good gender diversity. Research suggests men tend to create more aggressive ideas, while women are more pragmatic. Working together averages out these tendencies to produce novel and practical solutions. Without gender diversity, your team may end up producing a larger share of uninteresting or unsupportable concepts. And finally is cultural diversity. The best teams have members with different ethnic backgrounds. They broaden the team's perspective on how best to commercialize new inventions on a global scale. Without this, teams produce a larger share of niche ideas that may satisfy only one regional market. Now, here are some tips. Be sure to keep the group size at 12 or less. Any larger than that becomes hard to facilitate. Be sure participants are fully committed to participation in the workshop. Avoid letting people drop in and out as it suits their schedule. Otherwise, it interrupts the flow of the workshop. And be sure participants have the right level of knowledge about the topic. They'll have trouble contributing if they know nothing about the subject matter. And finally, make sure you reward the participants for being part of your session. You do that by practicing the golden rule of creativity. Give back your time and expertise to those who gave it to you. The most creative people practice the principle of reciprocity by helping others and asking their help when needed. Let's dive into the steps to running a great workshop. First, decide where to hold the workshop. Now, don't get carried away here. Any room will do. You don't need a so called innovation room with beanbag chairs and frisbees. I'm just not a big fan of these rooms because I don't think they do anything to boost creativity. Just find a room with comfortable chairs and flip charts. When you begin your workshop, start by identifying the constraints around the problem. Constraints might include budget issues, timing, or legal and regulatory boundaries. List them all. Hey, without constraints, the ideation will lack focus. You're likely to generate ideas that are too out to be viable. Now decide which of the 5 techniques to apply. For a refresher, revisit the videos in Chapter 2 of this course. Once you select the techniques, create a list of the components and attributes by writing them down on a whiteboard or flip chart or a pad of paper. Make sure you number the list. That helps keep the workshop more organized as you work through the lists. When you apply a technique, be sure to work in smaller teams of 2 or perhaps 3 people, not as one big, large group. Working in pairs is also more efficient. As you apply a technique, assign each pair a different component from the list. That forces them to really focus, and it increases their chance of coming up with a creative idea. Be sure to set a specific time limit, say 3 minutes. This further constrains their brain to think inside the box. When ideas are generated, try not to identify them with a specific person. Otherwise, people may bias the idea depending on who generated it. A simple way to do this is to have people write down their ideas. When giving credit for the source of an idea, make sure it's from the pair of colleagues, not just one person. You have to find ways to strip ideas of their identity. This will make sure ideas don't get thrown out prematurely. A typical workshop can be anywhere from an hour in length to several days. Hey, innovating is hard work, so be sure to manage the group's energy level. Take a lot of breaks during the workshop and mix up the activities to keep people engaged. Using good facilitation techniques will make sure you get the most out of your creativity workshop. Selecting the best ideas is an essential part of the creativity process. You want to make sure you spend your time only on those ideas with the most potential. Let's look at ways to evaluate ideas. First, you need to decide what qualifies as a really great idea. In other words, what criteria should you use to evaluate ideas? Now, it's important you do this first before even looking at the ideas generated. Otherwise, you run the risk of the ideas creating the criteria for you. Say you really like an idea, but it doesn't meet all your criteria, so you make up new criteria to fit the idea. That's wrong, and it'll lead to errors in judgment. So, what criteria do you select? Well, that's completely up to you, but don't have too many. 4 or 5 at most, and actually fewer is better. Let the most important criteria do the job for you. From my experience, most criteria fit into 2 types. How well does the idea fit with your company and its culture? And how much of an impact does the idea have on your business? Next, put all your ideas in a standard format. That'll make it a lot easier to evaluate them. I like to use a template like this: name of idea, description of idea, benefits, the target audience, and challenges. Every idea should have its own name, not just a number. Give it a name that will help people see what the idea is about. Use literal names, not vague or confusing ones. Finally, you're ready to start evaluating your list of ideas. First, let each member of the group read the entire list of ideas with all the benefits and challenges. They do this on their own. Then, using the criteria you decided on earlier, each participant is allowed to put check marks beside the 5 or 6 of their favorite ideas, meeting the criteria. The votes from each participant are tallied to determine the top ideas. Voting individually and anonymously has a lot of benefits. Each individual has their own biases of what makes a great idea, and they vote accordingly. But voting as a group tends to neutralize those individual biases. From my long experience, the group vote always tells you which ideas the company will prefer. True innovators generate great ideas, but they also use the wisdom of others to help evaluate them. Now that you know what it takes to become more creative, I encourage you to keep it up. Become a student of creativity so you continue to build your skills. For example, be sure to leverage social media. Find other people who use the SIT method. Share ideas and stories of how it's been used in practice. Join this growing community of SIT practitioners. Check out blogs, webinars, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Pinterest. If you visit my Pinterest site, for example, you'll find a board for each of the 5 techniques with examples of products that demonstrate that pattern. But the most important advice I can give you is this: just go out there and do it. Begin by applying one of the techniques to something at work or at home. As you see success, you'll gain more confidence to use more of the method. And that's exactly what highly creative people do to make the world a better place.